All right, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to watch a little video by Shawn Baker and we'll have a little bit of commentary. So let's get into it.
Good morning, everybody. It is 20 degrees below zero Fahrenheit here in Big Sky, Montana. So debating whether we're going to go.
Just to cover what this study is that he's going to talk about.
Right here in Big Sky.
Let me pause it right here. So this is a study. It's available on pubmed.gov and it is titled Controversy on the Correlation of Red and Processed Meat Consumption with Colorectal Cancer Risk, an Asian Perspective. Okay. So if you search for that, you should be able to find this study, at least the summary of the study for yourself.
Montana, so debating whether we're going to go skiing or not. It's so freaking cold. But anyway, I wanted to follow up on the video I posted this morning. That was from an interview I did back in 2020 with Bart from Bar Stars. And this was done in Manhattan. Anyway, talking about just cancer risk and meat consumption. And, you know, it's largely been pushed that colorectal cancer is associated with red meat. The hazard ratios are incredibly low, 1.17% or something like that, 17%.
So he's talking about the hazard ratio there. So the hazard ratio, just to pull this up for you. All right, the hazard ratio is a comparison between the probability of events, right, in a treatment group compared to the probability of events in a control group. So you're simply dividing one over the other. So you take your you take group A and you're looking for something in it, and then you have a separate group, group B, right, that doesn't have that particular habit or isn't consuming that food or whatever you're looking at. And then you just simply look at that ratio, right? So you have a risk of that occurring in one group and you have a risk of that occurring in the other group. You divide them out. If it's a 1, it means the risk is exactly the same in both groups, right? If there's a larger than 1, then that means the top group had a slightly higher risk of that occurring. So a 1.17 means there's a 17% increase chance. Now that doesn't mean like 17%. Like that doesn't mean, say it's a risk of cancer, right? That's over your baseline risk. So whatever your baseline risk is, increase that by 17%. Okay, so if your baseline risk of getting, say it's 10%, your baseline risk of getting cancer was 3% or whatever, right? And this sort of, whatever you did, whatever this group did, it increased by 10%, right? Group A over group B. So that would be a 1.1, right? Well, then that means that their total risk went from a 3%, that's the baseline risk for everyone, to a 3.3%. So now you have that in your head. Now you know that an increase of 10% is an increase over the baseline of 10%. And that matters a lot. So you can't just be like, oh, no, my risk of cancer went from 3% to 13%. No, it did not. It went from 3% to 3.3%. So that's a big difference. All right, let's get back to the video. Just wanted to emphasize that because most people don't understand that. Now you can see here in this study, if you read this, it says that a consumption of fruit or vegetables was not associated with decreased risk of cancer, right? And it's got the quartiles listed, right? And there was, basically it's a 1.03 respectively for fruit and 1.07 and 0.98 respectively for vegetables. So this was the lowest quartiles of intake for men and women. So these are men and women who did not consume a lot of fruit or vegetables, okay? So 1.03 for both men and women for those that did not consume a lot of fruit, 1.07 and 0.98 respectively for those that did not consume much vegetables. All those numbers are right around 1, okay? And remember that this is correlation, this is not causation. So we're not proving any cause and effect. We're simply saying, here's some things that we saw, the data that we studied, and here's what we saw in that data. If there's some sort of causation, we haven't proved it. We've only proved an association between those things. And you would need an interventional study to prove that this correlation, to test your hypothesis that this correlation was somehow causation. All right, so let's get back to the video.
Which, when you look at absolute risk numbers like 1%, it's not much. It's based on nutritional epidemiology.
All right, so he's talking about the absolute risk, right? Again, I was saying 3%. He says it's 1%. So maybe we're talking about 1% here, right? So you go from a 1% to literal. You just multiply by those numbers you have, 1% to 1.07%. Okay, it's not huge. It's not huge at all.
Largely junk, quite honestly. This is a study that was done looking at Asian populations in general and red meat consumption, and they looked at all the different various studies that have been done in the overall.
So this was colon cancer in the highest quartile of fruit and vegetable intake compared with the lowest, okay? And the risk for vegetables alone was 1.24, and for fruit alone was 1.45. It says there's no statistically significant association observed between fruit and vegetable consumption and the risk of colorectal cancer.
Basically, when you look at the Asian data, there's no real relationship. You know, it doesn't happen in Asian for some reason. So what's the difference between Asians consuming meat and Americans consuming meat? Well, probably the fact that, you know, we're eating it in a bun with French fries and a Coca-Cola and all that, you know, stuff that's pretty obvious to see for anybody that really looks into this stuff. But, you know, if you look further through some of the Asian data, you see some of this really interesting stuff like fruit and vegetable consumption not shown to decrease risk of cancer. There's a study here, I think the Miyagi cohort study, looking at fruit and vegetable consumption, and actually they saw a slight increase in colorectal cancer rates in fruit and vegetable consumption.
Just want to go back to something that he's talking about here.
Well, if you look further through some of the Asian data, you see some of this really. Americans consuming meat, well, probably the fact that, you know, we're eating it in a bun with French fries and a Coca-Cola and all that, you know, stuff that's pretty obvious to see for anybody that really looks into this stuff.
Okay, so what he's talking about there is all of the other things that we eat, right, with whatever food's being looked at in the study. These are often called confounding factors, and how well a study is put together reflects how well these confounding factors are controlled for. They have to be controlled for. If they're not well controlled for, then you can't know, was it the bun? Was it the meat patty? Was it something, a sauce, ketchup, or something else on the patty? Was it just something even in the bun? Not even the bun, but just a single ingredient in the bun? Was it a single ingredient that's been added to the meat? You don't know, right? That's why you have to be careful with these studies, these epidemiological studies, because a lot of times the confounding factors aren't adequately controlled for. These are not interventional studies, right? And even if they are, you have to ask yourself, okay, let's say they was a well-done study of hamburger patties. Well, what hamburger patties were there? Were they from a McDonald's? Were they hamburger patties that were literally just ground beef? Maybe they were pre-cooked and packaged with a bunch of preservatives. Maybe they were processed, but they were raw. Were they grass-fed? Does that even matter? We often don't know the quality of these or the ingredients of, the supposed hamburger. So again, these are also additional confounding factors.
It's one of those things where there's a narrative being pushed, right? The World Health Organization, as many of you guys realize, is very narrative based, and the actual data, when you really look into it, is very weak, and it's very heterogeneous, whereas you have one study says one thing, one study says another thing.
Yeah, so this is a good point here. And he's talking about different epidemiological studies. And one thing that we see a lot of is a epidemiological study that fits a certain opinion or a certain bias that people have, and everybody has bias, all right? So don't tell me that, scientists don't have bias. Scientists don't act on, or only act on data, okay? Because yeah, we've reversed our opinions on a lot of things, even within the last 50 years, right? Because we've disproven our theories. So we think one thing, we don't know, we think, and then we test, and then we find out we were right or wrong. And that's the science. And then even then, the science may only reveal a portion, right? And then we might find that our understanding was incomplete. So, that's the whole thing of figuring out that, thinking that, fire or air is an element, and then realizing that fire and air are not elements, right? Air is made of elements, right? And then figuring out that those elements, right, that matter is made of, those are molecules, and then molecules, or there's atoms, there's, you have the atomic structure, down into the single atoms with, protons, neutrons, and electrons. You just keep falling further down the rabbit hole of understanding when you start to learn about these things that exist that we didn't even know they existed before, okay?
With very, very weak ratios, 1.2, 1.4, 1.3. Those things are largely meaningless, particularly when it comes to epidemiology. When you look at the randomized controlled trials looking at red meat and colorectal cancer or any type of cancer or heart disease, they're basically zero. There are no randomized controlled trials that show that red meat causes any disease whatsoever.
And I believe the studies that were done that are epidemiological, there's a very weak association. So again, it's like a 1.17 or something like that. So, that increases your risk 17% over baseline. Now, keep in mind that a 1, again, means there's no positive or negative correlation, right?
When we're looking at the hierarchy of evidence, we look at randomized control trials, and this is something that the Nutrex 2019 study, the largest study ever done on red meat, 14 researchers from around the world, they concluded that the evidence suggesting that red meat causes cancer or heart disease is so weak, it is so poor quality, that it should be largely ignored, and you should eat as much meat as you feel comfortable eating.
So that kind of ties back into the World Health Organization, the Handpicked studies. I mean, there was many studies that were available, and they talked about a large data set. They were talking about hundreds and hundreds of studies, but at the end of the day, they handpicked, maybe somewhere between a dozen to 24 studies, right? And I don't even think they used 24. It was less than that. So when you're talking about a data sets, hundreds and hundreds of studies, 700-800 studies, and you handpick, a dozen of those and say, see, this causes this, and your smoking gun is 1.17 hazard ratio, it basically means that there's no definitive correlation. It's such a weak association that you should probably not put a lot of stock in it at all, because it's just another epidemiological study.
And I can tell you, for someone who eats, 3 pounds a day, every day, and has been doing it for 6 years, I remain in excellent health, and it's something, and the people that do that, the other people that do that, the thousands and thousands of people that eat meat-heavy diets and exclude the processed garbage food, and I think that's the big difference there. The folks that exclude the processed garbage food, so not the standard American diet, and we often see standard American diet is meat and sugary stuff, and they somehow sort of blame it on the meat, when in truth, the average American, and most people don't know this, the average American eats around slightly under 2 ounces of red meat a day, or 2 ounces of beef a day. That is an incredibly small amount. 2 ounces is, about, something, tiny little piece like that. of red meat, and then they're eating, 60-70% of their diet is coming from refined grain, sugar, soybean oil.
Okay, so this is another hugely important point, and he's talking about processed foods, right? And he's talking about how much red meat we eat. And so if you look at like the last 30, 40, 50 years, the amount of red meat consumption in the United States has gone down. The amount of butter consumption in the United States has gone down and was largely replaced with grains, right, as he mentioned, and replaced with seed oils, vegetable oils, which are, oils that are created with an industrial process. And those oils, because they're full of polyunsaturated fatty acids, which are very delicate oils that easily goes rancid, these oils are extremely damaged from the moment they're created. And then he also talked about refined carbohydrates. And again, if you look at things that people want to point the finger at as supposedly being responsible for obesity, metabolic diseases such as diabetes and cancer and heart disease, they're going to point the finger at fat, animal fats, saturated fats, and they're going to point the finger at red meat, probably. So what's magic about red meat versus other meats? Again, they're basically leveraging that saturated fat argument because red meat is higher in saturated fats. That said, most wild animals that eat a wild diet are going to have a profile that's heavy in saturated and monounsaturated fats with very little polyunsaturated fatty acids, which again are those fatty acids that can easily be damaged, easily oxidized, producing, free radicals, which is not something that you want a whole lot of in your system. Now, if you look at what's increased over the last 50 years, what have we increased our consumption of? Dramatically. We've increased our consumption of three things dramatically, and that's grains. I mean, everything has a processed grain in it now. The vegetable oils, everything has canola or soy or something like that in it, and refined carbs in the form of high fructose corn syrup, just like refined table sugar. Those are like the three, the triple threat there that you'll hear people in the carnivore and primal communities talk about all the time. And they talk about the three things that you need to avoid. And Paul Saladino has talked about this before too. If you really want to sort of leverage your diet to produce health, then the three things you need to avoid are grains, and you need to avoid vegetable/seed oils, whatever you want to call them, and you need to avoid refined carbs. Not the same as, say, natural carbohydrates. So we're not equating a strawberry with a teaspoon of high fructose corn syrup. Those aren't the same thing. Again, if you're going to make the argument through correlation that, butter is going to cause cancer or cause obesity, or red meat is going to cause cancer or heart disease, then if those things have decreased over the last 50 years, while the consumption of refined grains, refined carbohydrates, and vegetable oils have increased, then you don't have correlation, right? How is it that those diseases are taking off when the consumption of meat and dairy or saturated fats has fallen dramatically, while the consumption of these other three things, these heavily processed items, has increased dramatically? It doesn't make sense, right? There's a logical fallacy there. There's a logical break there in their data, and they haven't followed it all the way to its logical extent. And as a result, you get this, hey, we're consuming too much of these things, which is why all these diseases are increasing when we've actually been consuming less and less and less and less every year for decades.
Eat meat, enjoy it, get the protein in, do the strength training, get healthy, improve your quality of life, and ignore the narrative-driven stuff which is being going on. As you guys see, these narratives are being pushed for the gain of likely corporate interests.
So one last thing to add, my personal experience, with eliminating those three things and switching to an animal-based diet is that my markers, and we can talk about this more in a separate video, but my biomarkers have improved, right? So my blood markers for like my HbA1c improved. It went from like a 5.4 to a 4.9, right? Over a period of like, 3 years ago, it was in that over 5, and now it's under 5, right? And then triglycerides have gone down. My HDL has gone up / been stable / gone up a little bit. LDL and total cholesterol is something that we have to talk about in more detail. So there's all these things that you can look at, but all of these are just risk factors. And I recently had a coronary artery calcium score, and I'm clean as a whistle. And I've been eating an animal-based diet, high in eggs, high in red meat, high in animal proteins, high in animal-based fats, right? Ghee and butter. Those are the primary fats that I use to cook with, but mainly ghee. That's what I eat. And I eat a lot of beef, pork, some chicken, and some pork. I eat that sparingly. We can cover that in more detail later, but my numbers look great. I know that's just one person, but if you go into the carnivore community, you'll see that repeated by many, many people. So just something to consider. Remember, you are your own experiment. So none of this is medical advice or dietary advice. I'm just telling you my experiences and talking about some of the funky stuff that happens with the science that you have to keep in mind so that you can make up your own mind and you can make an educated decision for yourself. All right, so that's all I have for today. Hope you enjoyed the video. We'll see you next time.